Top Med Talk. Welcome to Top Med Talk. I'm Andy Cumpstey and I'm your host today, and we're here at the Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine World Congress in London. And it's great to be back really at what's the home of Top Med Talk. So Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine, or EBPOM. So in many ways this is where it all started. And we've just had a fantastic opening session with some really brilliant speakers on shared decision making. And I'm delighted they've all agreed to come and join us now to have a bit more of a conversation about that. So I'll ask them to introduce themselves to you.
My name is Bob Evans. I'm a lay and patient representative here for EBPOM. I had a few moments to share my experience of perioperative care and shared decision making on my case of prostate cancer, which was effective. I sit on the board of the Centre for Perioperative Care. I'm very pleased to share a conversation with you this morning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bob. And Debra?
I'm Debra Leung. I'm a staff specialist anaesthetist or anesthesiologist from the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, Australia. I've got a clinical and research interest in prehabilitation and shared decision-making as it pertains to high-risk surgical oncology patients, and I run communication skills workshops and training programs to facilitate shared decision-making in these kinds of contexts.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Alf?
It's lovely to be here. I'm Alf Collins. I'm currently a freelance health consultant and a communication skills trainer. I've been a communication skills trainer since the early 90s with an interest very specifically in shared decision-making. For 9 years, from 2015 to 2023, I was the National Clinical Director for Personalised Care and Shared Decision-Making for NHS England. Lovely to be here.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us. Shared decision-making is a really important topic for us as perioperative physicians, and therefore it's not a surprise that we've covered this topic a lot of times before on Top Med Talk. But I don't think what we've ever done before is had a patient, a clinician, and some policy expertise all in the same conversation. So I'm really keen to see how that's going to play out over the next few minutes. But to start with, I'm going to come to you, Al, first, if that's okay, because you gave us the initial talk. And just pick up some of the things that you discussed in the auditorium. But I mean, one of the first things that hit me was, this isn't really a new topic at all, is it?
No, we've been talking about it for actually at least 40 years.
Wow.
But I think what's changed, certainly in this country over the last probably 15 years, 10 years more particularly, is that 20 years ago I was trying to convince people to do it. The talks that I give now are less convincing people to do it, more about supporting people to figure out how to do it. So I think that's a really, really good change that we've seen. What I would say is I still think the evidence tells us we've still got a pretty long way to go. There is enormous variability. There are some people who are great at it. Broadly speaking, the evidence is that most of us, be better than we think we are.
And again, that's a point you brought up quite nicely in the talk, but both patients and clinicians, one overestimates the benefits and underestimate the risks. But also clinicians, we tend to overestimate how good at this we really are. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially about, it's a horrible phrase, but unconscious incompetence. We tend to think, because we talk with patients all the time, we have conversations with patients all the time, it's part of the kind of identity of being a clinician. And if somebody says to you, well, maybe you're not quite as good at that as you think you are, it's a bit of a personal threat. It's a challenge, So, using data, getting patients to tell us, the degree to which they think we're sharing decisions is, I think, an important first step.
So maybe let's bring Debra and Bob in on that point then. But Debra, coming to you first, from a clinician's point of view, do you think that's a fair comment? And if so, how do we improve that as an individual perioperative physician?
No, I would absolutely echo all those us comments about that. There's a volume of data to show that we don't do it as well as we want to, or as well as we think that we need to. And I think that probably the first step to solving any problem, as we know, is acknowledgement that there is a problem. So I think we're now at that stage where we're kind of moving through the spectrum, or the sort of the phases of, our ability to do shared decision-making. As I said, first it was trying to convince people that this is a necessary thing. I think we're all on the bandwagon now. I think, we're all, as perioperative clinicians and patients, we're all on the same bandwagon that we want to do this. But I think the next step is really, as you said, trying to work out how we do this effectively and consistently every time. So the Bob, referring back to his talk earlier on, the Bob and each of his brothers is receiving the same quality of shared decision-making at every intervention. It's not just that Bob's lucky that he happened to go to a service and through a pathway that had very, extensive and well-developed shared decision-making, whereas maybe, some of his other family members weren't, able to have that opportunity. So I think it's about trying to make pragmatic ways that we can sort of enhance and facilitate shared decision-making principles in all discussions and all the patient encounters. But I think that there's also still that acknowledgement, which I think all of us were sort of commensurate within that session, that saying that there's always going to be this 5 to 10% of patients where we need to allocate extra resources and extra training and extra sort of time to. And I think that we can't sort of say that shared decision-making is for all without acknowledging that there are these very high-risk group of patients who have these extra needs. And it's sort of how do we support both of those sort of frameworks of SDM. So SDM for the many and then SDM for the very high-risk view. And I think it's about in the same way that, like say point-of-care ultrasound's a good one. We have lots of perioperative clinicians who can do point-of-care ultrasound. But for the really tricky cases, we still need to send them for formal ultrasonography with experts who know how to do that in very challenging situations that are out of the norm. And I think shared decision-making as an intervention is very similar to any other perioperative intervention in that sense.
So Bob, we're very fortunate to have you here who've been through this process, but what do you think about those comments that Debra and Alf have just made?
Yeah, I think that, we're all guilty in whatever walk of life we're in of a bit of imposter syndrome, and even the most competent clinicians may have a bit of that. But I think it is really all about communication, as so many other issues in life. If people can speak clearly and effectively and purposely with each other, two-way process, talking about a condition, listening to advice, and that advice giver listening again to the priorities and personal issues that the patient endures, then we're moving truly towards it. And as I said at the end of my talk in the hall, the strapline of Top Med Talks is conversation, and it really is all about talking in a structured and effective way, not aimless ramblings as I'm doing now probably, but some degree of focus to move things forward.
Wasn't aimless or random at all, but you're right, that structured and effective communication is vital, but also trainable, do we think? Is that fair to say?
Completely. Debra and I have been trainers for a long time. It's interesting, actually, looking back maybe 15, 20 years, a lot of us in the world of shared decision-making saw it as actually quite a technical skill. We saw it as a kind of a risk communication exercise. Increasingly in the world literature, it's become very, very evident that it's primarily relational. And the kind of bottom line for relational skills is trust, rapport, empathy. And one of the kind of, I guess, kind of sad things about the way we train doctors, and there's a guy called Jeremy Howick who works in Leicester's just on a systematic review, has shown that training medical students, what we do when we train medical students, is that we drain them of empathy.
Wow.
So one of the core pieces in communication skills training is supporting people to build trust, build rapport, and actually reconnect with the empathy that's been drained out of us through the medical education process.
Just to add sort of granularity to what Alf was saying, I think there's sort of two things that struck me as he was talking. One is that, the trainability, as you're referring to, has no ceiling effect. So we know that no matter how skilled you are as a healthcare communicator, you can always get better. And so again, just, we've been talking a lot about iterative processes today. Communication skills training is iterative. I still go back as a participant to communication skills training, even though I'm a facilitator, because I recognize that you can always get better. But what we do know is that the people or the group of sort of clinicians who feel less skilled in it probably have the greatest effect by a small amount of communication skills training. So it should be a lifelong sort of communication skills training project for all of us, but certainly the least confident you feel about it, the more you stand to benefit from getting some formal communication skills training.
It's so important, this communication stuff as well. I mean, basic skills, making eye contact with people. You're breaking bad news to somebody. Afraid to tell you, you do have a form of cancer, that I can reassure you that there are pathways where we can get this sorted, etc. And look at people in the eye and saying that. I find that being thrown in, having to speak to 700 people at a public meeting, telling them something they didn't want to hear about an incinerator that was going to be located near to them. If you come out of that meeting alive, then it actually prepares you very much more effectively for speaking on a one-to-one basis. So, there's all sorts of ways you can train yourself. At the age of 16, I wouldn't have said boo to a goose. Now I can talk to anybody about anything, I think, and some of them still stay awake. So, it's a skill. You've got to develop it.
the explicit empathy skill, which is really what Bob's sort of very eloquently describing there, is I find personally a very, very difficult thing to do, coming back to the point, Alf made about all of this being relational and trust building and empathy and how important that is. But I think what sometimes we forget to convey, or sometimes we're not as effective as conveying to people trying to sort of get into these sort of meaty shared decision-making conversations, is that these kind of relational rapport building, explicit empathy skills actually have been proven to be very effective in improving the efficiency of your consultation. Because we repeatedly get questions as perioperative clinicians, how do I do this quicker? How do I do this more efficiently? I don't have an hour to do this. How do I do it in half an hour? And probably being able to develop those kind of skills to establish rapport quickly, because these are difficult conversations, so that you can get to the meat of that difficult conversation quickly, is all dependent on how quickly you can establish trust and rapport, because patients don't want to talk to you about these deeply personal things if they don't feel like they trust you with that information. And so being able to do that is fundamentally important, I feel, to shared decision making.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Again, from decades as a trainer, the conversations become incredibly focused. They really are about absolutely what matters to you, Bob. We're here to figure out together what the right thing to do is for you. They become very focused and highly efficient. But the evidence is that if you do them well, to make sure that the process, I think again we've talked about shared decision making as a process, not as an event, but the process that patients are informed in between those consultations, and are doing a little bit of homework if they want to, if they're up for it, in between those consultations. That makes the whole process much more efficient. And actually, it frankly doesn't take that much more time. That's what the evidence says.
And I guess it's a fine balance too, isn't it? Because we want to prepare the patients well for this conversation, but presumably we're not trying to lead them in one way or another. And how do we get that balance right? How do you make the process efficient without leading the patient one way or another, and without changing that informed consent process?
Again, it comes down to training and communication. You don't ask the leading questions. You don't prep the patient to give the answer that you as a clinician not only want, but would expect the patient to say. You've got to draw out the reality. You can't be biased in your approach to the patient. But I would say, on a slightly different tack, it's got to be easier for the NHS to perform in a context of total commitment to perioperative care as a concept. And it's important to commit to shared decision making as the principal component in that perioperative care. That's the only way that I think the health service can move forward in terms of surgeries and procedures. You will reduce the waiting list if you can cut complications. You can cut complications by making sure that the patient-centred prerogative is there in all that they do. It would avoid unwanted or unnecessary surgery. It would avoid people going off on courses of treatment that will very much lead to complications and readmissions to hospital. These are the things that are bogging the NHS down. And if we can all get it right first time, as the Gerft analogy has it, then you will make the waiting list into, in effect, a preparation list where proper prehabilitation can be brought in. And, the numbers will look much more favourable in a few years' time. It doesn't matter who's running the country. It seems such an obvious thing. Without perioperative care and SDM, you're going to make complications. It's easier to do it than not to do it.
Yeah. Just to play devil's advocate and say some of our listeners listening to this may not be quite as convinced by this process. Are there any risks to the process? Are there any cautions to be aware of and traps we don't fall into?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is a risk in it. And I think that, like with any intervention, if you do it badly and you execute it badly, those sins aren't accounted for by good intentions. And I think that that's a recognition that, shared decision making is a complex process that requires training. And therefore, there is, I think, certainly a risk that you could do it badly. And I think you pointed out, in your previous question about sort of the potential to lead patients in conversations, and then to think that we're doing shared decision-making, that we're potentially leading a patient down the path. And I think in terms of mitigating that risk, I think there's probably an underlying assumption that as clinicians, when we inadvertently lead patients to decisions, it's done with good intent. So we're not leading them because we're trying to obviate their personal, values and goals and that sort of thing. We're leading them or inadvertently because we think that there is something that probably either matches their, what we've heard from them and provides them with goal congruent care, but we're not really sure. So we sort of implicitly lead people to that conversation. And I think probably the most powerful thing that I've found to try and mitigate that risk is to really be transparent with the patient about your decision-making framework and why you might be potentially leading that to discussion. And it's usually because you've heard something from the patient, and in your sort of discussions with the patient, you've come to some sort of patient-centered treatment recommendation in your head. But what we often don't do is think that process out loud. So it seems like we're just saying, well, this is the best thing for you, you should do that. But often it is quite a considered process between us and all of the teams involved in sort of these sort of multidisciplinary team discussions. So I think the share thinking, to bring up, Lise Fleischer's point before in the talk about, is it shared decision-making or informed decision-making? I think the shared in it is not just that the final decision is shared, but the actual process and consideration of the whole decision-making paradigm across that perioperative clinical pathway is shared with the patient. It's not just shared between us as clinicians.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And Alf, anything you want to add on that point? Or?
Yeah, I've just been pondering as you were talking about some of the potential downsides. So many positive sides to this. It reconnects us with our core professional values. We feel this responsibility ourselves. You can end up at the end of clinics. If you made all the decisions yourself, you can end up feeling the weight of responsibility is enormous. What's not talked about quite so much is that when we reconnect with our professional values of empathy, it really does open us up emotionally. And, I'm married to a psychotherapist, and what psychotherapists have is every 2 weeks they have what's called supervision, where they share that emotional load. I think what we do in MDTs is we often share that emotional load implicitly.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to be a little bit more explicit about it. There's something called Schwartz rounds that are kind of an international way of kind of supporting people to articulate their unease. That comes from really being very, very open and honest and empathetic with people. So I think that's something we need to do a little bit more thinking about, actually, because I think it's happening now rather more implicitly than explicitly.
All great points. Yeah, Bob.
Actually, one of the things I wrote down to jog my memory before we came on air, as it were, is a concept of equipoise.
Yes.
Research clinicians are well aware of the possibility that they may be, from their own personal preferences and experiences, pushing the results of some research in a certain direction, and need to, under the concept of equipoise, not to do that, but to be random controlled trials must be exactly that. And I guess it's the same for shared decision making. The concept of equipoise needs to be put in place so that, any danger of a clinician being overbearingly leading in one direction or the other is dealt with, really. Yeah, I mean, you clinicians are human beings as well as the patients, and there will be an emotional load on them, and they need the opportunities, like in the private MDT sessions, or on the pillow with a psychotherapist on hand to unload these things is a great advantage, isn't it? Yeah.
Just quickly, from each of you, could you give me one point that you're going to take away from the session this morning? Not necessarily what you've said, but from everything we've heard today.
Yeah. Let's check on the effectiveness of SDM and generally keep talking.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bob.
There's a lot of work that we need to do to kind of get this embedded effectively in a policy way, and I think that's our real sort of challenge for the future.
One thing I heard from the panel, one of the panellists, was the concept of a patient navigator or an advocate or a peer supporter, and I don't think we do enough of that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. One, for a really fantastic and inspirational set of talks this morning, great session, and also thank you for joining us here on Top Med Talk. I think we'll have to wrap it up there, so thank you all for listening at home to Top Med Talk. You can find and listen to us, as you know, on our app, through our website, or on your favourite podcasting platforms. Please make sure if you do that, you do like and subscribe to us, because it helps keep us free at the point of listening, whether that's on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, or formerly Twitter, or now on YouTube. And most importantly, make sure you tick and like those when you see us. And finally, most important of all, thanks for joining in the conversation. We'll see you a bit later.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook and X. Also, it's important to remember that Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.